Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the golden glow of the desert at dusk. The air is warm and carries the faint scent of sand baked under the sun all day. Far away, the Nile drifts like a ribbon of silver beneath the evening sky. This is ancient Egypt, a place of gods and pyramids of myths and power. But tonight, we'll peel back the gold and jewels and see the truth about what it was really like to be a pharaoh. Most of us picture the pharaoh's life as nothing but splendor, a grand throne, rich food, servants who bow at every turn. But the reality was far more complicated. Being a pharaoh was not just about wearing a crown. It was about carrying the weight of an entire civilization. Every flood, every drought, every sickness, all of it was seen as a reflection of the pharaoh's ability to please the gods. And that meant the pressure to be perfect never stopped. Let's start our journey tonight in the pharaoh's palace. The sun has just set, and the great halls are dimly lit with oil lamps. The flames flicker gently against walls covered with hieroglyphs, each one carved to tell the story of victories and divine blessings. Servants walk silently, their bare feet whispering across smooth stone floors. The pharaoh himself sits quietly, wearing not a crown, but a simple linen garment. The golden mask and jewels, those are for public display. But here in private, he is simply a man, tired, thoughtful, and often alone. As we explore this life together, I want you to relax. Find a comfortable place, take a slow, deep breath, and let the images of ancient Egypt fill your mind. Imagine the coolness of stone walls around you, the gentle sound of palm leaves rustling in the wind outside. Tonight, we're not here for battles or excitement. We're here to slow down, to listen to the quiet history of a ruler who carried burdens far heavier than gold. Being pharaoh was not a choice for most rulers. They were born into the role, trained from childhood to behave like a living god. Even as young children, future pharaohs were taught to walk, speak, and even breathe in a way that reflected dignity. They could never run freely through the palace gardens or play without being watched. From the moment they could talk, they were told that the entire nation would one day depend on them. Imagine that kind of pressure. As the young heir sat with tutors, learning complex hieroglyphs, religious chants, and laws, every mistake was corrected. A pharaoh could never be weak, never cry, never show fear. Because to the people, the pharaoh was more than human, he was divine. And so, even as a child, he lived with the knowledge that one day, every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of people. The palace itself was a place of beauty and silence. Servants moved like shadows, always present but never intrusive. Every meal, every garment, every word spoken to the pharaoh was carefully prepared. Even his sleep was treated with ritual importance, the bed covered with fine linen, incense burning to keep away evil spirits. But comfort was not the same as freedom. The pharaoh could never just be himself. He had to be perfect at all times, even when no one was watching. In the next chapter, we'll walk through a full day in the life of a pharaoh. From the moment the sun rises over the Nile to the last quiet moments of the night, we'll explore the endless rituals, the ceremonies, and the heavy isolation of being seen as a god. The stone walls feel cool beneath your fingertips. But for now, let's rest here for a moment in the quiet of the palace at dusk. The oil lamps flicker. Outside, the stars are beginning to appear, and the night is just beginning. From the moment a future pharaoh was born, life was anything but simple. The cries of the newborn were often met with reverence and fear, because this child was not just a child. He was considered chosen by the gods. Every coo, every smile, and every step was watched closely by priests, advisors, and servants who believed they were shaping a future divine ruler. Imagine growing up in a palace surrounded by towering stone pillars, lush gardens filled with exotic plants, and intricate pools of water reflecting the bright Egyptian sun. It sounds beautiful, and it was, but it was also a place of discipline. Each symbol wasn't just a letter, but a story, a sacred meaning that had to be memorized perfectly. Friends were few and carefully chosen. Every meal was formal. Every conversation was monitored. He or she would eat alone at times, with priests and advisors watching over them rather than family members who could offer comfort or warmth. Another tutor might focus on history, reciting the great deeds of the rulers before them. They weren't allowed to be ordinary. They had to be extraordinary, even if they didn't feel that way. When the day of coronation arrived, they would put on the crown, and the people would cheer. But inside, many pharaohs likely felt fear. Fear of the enormous burden ahead. Imagine being a young boy, knowing that even your siblings could one day become your rivals for the throne. Trust was difficult to find. Every action the young heir took was recorded, judged, or interpreted as a sign of divine will. Did the prince smile at a certain servant? It might be seen as a sign from the gods. Did he fall ill? It could be interpreted as a bad omen. You must be better than all of them, they would whisper. The gods have chosen you to continue their legacy. While other children played freely on the banks of the Nile, the young prince or princess spent their days learning how to behave like a god in human form. But for now, picture a young boy or girl sitting in a palace garden at sunset, staring at the horizon, knowing their life will never be their own. Tutors filled every hour of their day. One tutor might teach hieroglyphs, those intricate symbols carved into stone and written on papyrus. Then there were the religious lessons. Priests would visit, teaching the young heir the rituals and prayers that would one day be required of them. Every single day of their life, even as a child, they would learn how to offer incense, how to speak the names of the gods, and how to move with grace during ceremonies. Mistakes were not tolerated because a single wrong word, a single misstep in the future, could mean angering the gods and bringing disaster upon Egypt. The training wasn't all about reading and religion. The young pharaoh-to-be also learned physical skills. Archery, chariot driving, and even mock battles were part of the curriculum. After all, a pharaoh was expected to lead the army into war if necessary. Even as a boy, the prince was handed a bow, told to draw it back, and shown how to ride horses in the hot desert sun. That this childhood was lonely. The heir to the throne could never truly be a child. Even family life was complicated. Pharaohs often had many wives and children, which led to rivalries and political tension. The palace itself, while magnificent, could feel like a cage. Guards were stationed everywhere. Servants whispered in corners. By the time the heir reached adulthood, every part of their personality had been shaped by expectation. In our next chapter, we'll explore what it was like to live a single day as a pharaoh from dawn until midnight, where every hour was filled with rituals, decisions, and demands. And now, dear listener, as the torchlight flickers across the temple walls, we step deeper into the pharaoh's world not just as a ruler, but as a god walking among men. But what did it truly mean to bear the title Son of Ra? Let's gently unravel the weight of divine expectation in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was not merely a monarch. He was believed to be a living deity, the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. Upon death, he would merge with Osiris, the lord of the underworld. This was not symbolic poetry. It was a reality etched into stone, sung by priests, and lived by the pharaoh from birth to death. But this divinity came at a price. From the moment a pharaoh ascended the throne, he was no longer truly his own person. His every word, gesture, and breath was tied to the stability of the cosmos, the concept of Mat, the sacred order of the universe. If crops failed, if the Nile didn't flood as expected, the people whispered, had the pharaoh offended the gods? He was bathed by priests in sacred waters, his body anointed with perfumed oils derived from myrrh and frankincense. Pharaohs married within the royal bloodline, sometimes even sisters, not for love, but to keep their godlike heritage pure. It was a lonely cage gilded with gold, surrounded, always, but rarely seen for who you truly are. Incense was burned not to please him, but to shield him from impure forces. The pharaoh had to perform daily rituals at multiple temples, sometimes via priests, sometimes himself, especially during important festivals. Imagine being ill, or weary, or in pain and still being expected to appear radiant and eternal. He was responsible for commissioning monuments, temples, and tombs not only to glorify his reign, but to uphold the spiritual fabric of the nation. Had Mat been broken, his soul would journey through the duat, the underworld, facing monstrous beasts and moral reckoning. His heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma at his failures and flaws exposed. Before the gods, what would it be like to simply be a man? He bore this burden not only in rituals but in every waking hour. It wasn't always glory. It was duty. It was weight. It was silence. Every morning began not with ease, but with lengthy purification rituals. He would then be dressed not by servants, but by attendants trained in spiritual ceremony. Each piece of clothing, every amulet, had symbolic meaning. His false beard, that long, braided symbol of kingship, was a divine signifier. He couldn't laugh freely in public. To be divine was to be untouchable. And the crown he wore, often the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, was not simply regal attire. It was believed to hold the power of the gods themselves. But such holiness isolated him. He couldn't be casual or candid. Even his family life was often arranged to maintain divine lineage. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being revered like a god, yet utterly alone. It wasn't just personal sacrifice. He had to build, to rule, to feed the people, to protect borders, to lead religious rites, all while embodying godhood. And when he aged, the burden grew no lighter. Even in death, there was no rest. The mummification process was designed not only to preserve the body, but to prepare the pharaoh for an eternity of judgment and divine labor. So, even after death, the pharaoh worked. Perhaps in the deepest hours of night, when the palace halls fell silent, the pharaoh looked up at the ceiling painted like the heavens and wondered. This was the cost of divinity in a world shaped by gods and sand. And now, let us walk forward. In the next chapter, we'll leave the throne room and step into the royal court, where political schemes whispered in shadows and loyalty was often a mask. Stay close, the candlelight still burns. And now, as we drift deeper into the pharaoh's palace, let us draw back the silk curtains of ceremony and step into the flickering shadows of power, where loyalty was uncertain and every smile could hide a blade. Being a pharaoh meant living at the very heart of a kingdom, but not always safely. It may seem strange. The pharaoh was worshipped after all. His word was law, his face carved into colossal temples. But even gods were vulnerable, especially when surrounded by humans chasing influence. Behind the polished stone walls of the palace, beneath the sacred paintings and golden statues, the royal court was a hive of ambition, gossip, and silent warfare. The Egyptian royal court was vast and complex. At the top sat the pharaoh, but surrounding him was a carefully layered hierarchy: viziers, priests, scribes, military generals, and even royal wives, each playing their part in a delicate balance of favor and politics. Let us begin with the vizier, often considered the pharaoh's right hand. The vizier managed the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom, overseeing tax collection, managing the granaries, resolving legal disputes, and controlling the army and building projects. A powerful vizier could essentially run Egypt while the pharaoh performed rituals and received foreign dignitaries. But such power made viziers both indispensable and dangerous. A pharaoh had to constantly judge whether his vizier served the throne or plotted to claim it. Marriages were tools of diplomacy, but they were also breeding grounds for tension. The harem was not always a peaceful sanctuary. It was, at times, a political battlefield in fine linen. Each wife sought to elevate her own children, hoping one day her son might wear the double crown. Then came the high priests, a group of court officials, servants, and even one of his wives plotted to assassinate him and place her son on the throne. They orchestrated secret meetings, used coded messages, and bribed palace guards. The plot was eventually uncovered, but not before serious damage was done. They recorded official decrees, tracked tax records, managed land ownership documents, and preserved royal legacy. Through stone inscriptions and scrolls, a loyal scribe could immortalize a pharaoh. A disloyal one could distort his story for generations. Royal tasters sampled meals to prevent poisoning. Servants were carefully watched. Letters and petitions passed through layers of scrutiny. A poorly managed succession could lead to civil war. The pharaoh, already burdened with ritual and governance, also had to prepare the future with caution and often secrecy. His death left a vacuum, and the mysterious rise of and then Horemheb followed. Each step filled with political maneuvering, each ruler rewriting what came before, where even Pharaoh's divine rulers had to play the game of survival. While feeling utterly alone, knowing that everyone bows when you enter but few do so with a pure heart. Assassination was rare, but the fear of it never left the pharaoh's chambers. Temples were not just religious centers, they owned land, collected donations, and educated the elite. The conspirators were put on trial, tortured, and executed. It was a scandal that shook the kingdom and showed just how vulnerable a pharaoh could be within his own walls. The priests of Ammon at Thebes, for instance, became so wealthy and autonomous that later pharaohs had to break their power to keep balance in the realm. Perhaps being a pharaoh wasn't just about grandeur and glory. It was a tightrope walk across fire and silence, living in a golden palace, surrounded by luxury yet sleeping with one eye open, unsure which trusted voice might be your undoing. In a land where gods were as present as the river Nile, priests wielded enormous influence. A cleverly placed omen, a dream interpreted with bias, a rumor about the pharaoh's favor with the gods, such things could shift public opinion and tilt alliances. And in the court, whispers from priests could carry divine weight. Behind the scenes, the royal wives and concubines also shaped court life. The pharaoh typically had a great royal wife and several lesser wives, often from noble Egyptian or foreign families. Mothers influenced their sons, forged alliances with priests and viziers, and even interfered with military appointments. History offers chilling glimpses of court betrayal. One of the most famous is the harem conspiracy during the reign of Ramses III. The trial records, preserved on ancient papyrus, reveal a court filled with paranoia. Imagine, if you will, even the pharaoh's food and drink were not safe. Scribes, though quiet and often overlooked, held enormous influence too. And looming above all was the fear of succession. Who would inherit the throne? Pharaohs often fathered many sons, sometimes from different mothers. Choosing an heir was not always simple. Brothers could turn on each other. Advisors might favor one over the other. Think of Tutankhamun, the boy king. After his death, court officials acted quickly, burying him in a modest tomb, possibly to avoid scandal. So the court, for all its beauty, its perfumes and painted pillars, was a garden of thorns. It was a place where appearances mattered more than truth, where one careless word could undo a dynasty. Imagine standing in a sunlit court, warm breeze lifting golden banners. That is the cost of power in a world of ambition. So, dear listener, let us now step away from the court and turn our gaze to the pharaoh's role beyond the palace. In the next chapter, we follow him into war and diplomacy where even gods must bleed, and empires rise on the edge of a blade. Rest now, and when you're ready, the journey continues. Let's take a slow breath in and out as we continue our journey into the lonely and complex world of the Egyptian pharaohs. They were not just kings, they were gods, or so the people believed. Each ruler was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, and when they died, they became Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians didn't see their pharaohs as mere mortals. If the pharaoh failed in his sacred duties, the entire balance of Mat, the cosmic order, could unravel. Imagine the pressure of not just ruling a kingdom, but of being divine. Every decision, every gesture, every ritual had to be perfect, not just politically, but cosmically. The pharaoh must have offended the gods, and the consequences for failure, far more terrifying than rebellion or poor harvests. A bad flood of the Nile, a plague. The pharaoh must have failed in his rituals, surrounded by incense smoke, chanting priests and golden idols. No one else was allowed this close to the gods. It was dark, quiet, and overwhelming. The weight of heaven and earth was on their shoulders. Let's pause for a moment and picture the pharaoh sitting alone in the inner sanctum of the temple of Ammon. He would have to perform ritual after ritual, speaking sacred words, offering food and drink to statues, reenacting mythic battles day after day. It wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. If the ritual wasn't done exactly right, the sun might not rise, or so the people feared. Can you imagine waking up each day, knowing the entire kingdom believes your actions determine whether the crops grow or the rivers flood? Sleep didn't come easy under that kind of pressure. Let's also talk about illness. What happened if a pharaoh got sick? He couldn't just go to bed and rest. A sick god, That was unthinkable. Some were practical, using honey or herbs. Others were pure magic, reciting prayers to banish demons or swallowing crushed gemstones. Priests and healers would swarm the palace with amulets, incantations, animal sacrifices, and sacred papyri full of remedies. He was bathed and dressed by attendants who never met his eyes, and when he did speak, it was usually to give orders or perform rituals. But the pharaoh couldn't afford to be seen coughing or limping. His body was a symbol of divine strength. Any sign of weakness could shake the people's faith or invite assassination. So even when exhausted, even when ill, he had to appear radiant, flawless, godlike. The palace is still, but already priests are preparing your sacred morning ritual. You'll be bathed, perfumed, and dressed in linen and gold. You'll walk barefoot into the temple to awaken the gods. Behind the palace walls, the pharaoh was isolated, surrounded by servants, scribes, guards, and advisors, and yet very much alone. No one spoke to him as an equal. He ate meals in silence while musicians played softly. He rarely saw his children. His wives lived in separate quarters. Even laughter had to be measured. A pharaoh didn't giggle. He smiled solemnly. You must offer the bread, pour the beer, light the incense, over and over. There were no casual conversations, no relaxing walks alone. Every movement was watched, every word remembered. You were a god on earth, but you could never truly be human. It's dawn. The people are waiting, where we'll explore the deadly sibling rivalries and palace conspiracies that often tore the pharaoh's world apart. The crops depend on you, the Nile depends on you, the sky depends on you. You must speak the incantation perfectly. You must move your hands just so, because if you don't, the sun might not rise. That was the belief, and you carried it every day. Let's pause here again. Let your mind rest and reflect. Being seen as divine didn't mean the pharaohs lived in bliss. It meant pressure beyond imagining, isolation from humanity, and constant fear of failing the gods. Their divine status was a gilded cage. Beautiful, yes, but still a cage. And now, let's gently move on to our next chapter. But for now, let your thoughts drift and imagine the lonely grandeur of ancient Egypt. Take a deep breath in and out. Let your thoughts drift back through time, through golden corridors and silent chambers into the palace of a pharaoh where wealth shimmered like the Nile. But danger waited in the shadows inside the palace. He was simply a man surrounded by ambition. Because while the outside world revered the pharaoh as a living god, and in ancient Egypt, betrayal often came wearing silk robes and smiling with eyes full of secrets. In theory, the pharaoh ruled alone, but in truth, the palace was full of powerful people, wives, children, priests, generals, and scribes, all with their own ambitions, and not everyone was loyal instead. Pharaohs often had dozens of children by different wives and concubines. Sometimes, they married their own sisters or daughters to maintain the purity of their bloodline. Let's begin with royal succession. It wasn't as simple as you might think. Unlike modern monarchies, Egypt didn't always have a clear rule of inheritance. The eldest son wasn't guaranteed the throne. This created confusion and deadly rivalry. Sons schemed against each other. Queens plotted to place their own child on the throne. Brothers betrayed brothers. And sometimes, even children plotted against their own father. Let's close our eyes for a moment and imagine the palace gardens at dusk. The air is heavy with jasmine, messages hidden in folded linen, a poison cup left waiting on a golden tray. Torches flicker in the breeze, palm trees sway, but behind the tranquil beauty, whispers drift through the columns. Secrets passed between courtiers, because when the crown is a god's crown, people will kill to wear it. Consider the story of Ramses III, one of the last great pharaohs. He ruled over a vast and powerful empire, but his harem was a dangerous place. One of his wives, Tai, wanted her son to be king, but he wasn't the designated heir, so she conspired, gathering allies from within the palace, scribes, guards, even magicians. Their plan was simple: murder Ramses III during a royal festival. These men controlled everything, from food supplies to religious ceremonies. We know this from a document historians call the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus. It tells of daggers drawn in secret, black magic spells, poisoned wine, and hushed meetings in moonlit courtyards. They failed, but the pharaoh was likely mortally wounded, only to have your name scraped away by someone who once bowed before you. And dozens of people, including his own wives and children, were tried and executed. But betrayal didn't always come with blades. Sometimes it was slower, quieter, more insidious. Pharaohs were surrounded by priests and viziers, advisors with enormous power. And if a pharaoh was young, sick, or distracted, these advisors could easily manipulate him or quietly rule in his place. Some even erased the names of previous kings from temple walls, stealing their legacy and replacing it with their own. Imagine spending your life trying to please the gods and protect your people, even in death. A pharaoh could be betrayed. Let's now walk through the Valley of the Kings. The stars above shimmer cold and distant. The tombs are hidden among rock and sand, carved deep into the earth. Pharaohs prepared for the afterlife their entire lives. Their tombs were elaborate, filled with treasures, food, and sacred scrolls. But many of them were looted, not by foreign invaders, but by their own workers and guards. The very people who built the tombs often returned to rob them. Gold, jewelry, sacred statues, all stolen. Many pharaohs endured. Even mummies were torn apart, stripped of amulets, left exposed. Imagine the flickering light of an oil lamp in a darkened palace corridor, footsteps echoing in silence, and secrets whispered in the night. The afterlife violated by greed. Let's pause and take a gentle breath. Even at the height of power, even surrounded by walls of stone and armies of servants, the pharaoh was never truly safe. Because where there is power, there is fear. And where there is fear, there is betrayal. And yet, for all the dangers they faced, they left behind monuments that still rise against the sky. Pyramids, temples, obelisks, speaking of greatness and godhood. But behind those carved stones were fragile human hearts, afraid, lonely, and sometimes betrayed. As we leave this chapter behind. And now, let us move gently into the next chapter, where we'll explore what daily life was really like behind the palace walls. Not the myths, but the quiet, simple routines of Egypt's royal court. Let's continue in peace. Let your eyes rest. Let your thoughts drift deeper into time, past the golden monuments and roaring crowds, into the quieter side of a pharaoh's world. The rituals, the rhythms, the subtle routines of daily life inside Egypt's most sacred and secretive place, the royal palace. Because even a god king still had to wake up each morning, still had to eat, bathe, dress, think, sleep. Let us walk gently now through those stone halls. The Egyptian palace wasn't one single structure. It was often a sprawling complex with courtyards, chambers, gardens, and temples, all within walking distance of each other. It wasn't built for coziness. It was built to impress, to intimidate, and above all, to separate the divine ruler from ordinary people. Each space had a purpose, and each movement within it followed strict ritual. Let's begin with morning. The sun has just risen over the Nile. Light floods through carved stone windows. Priests enter the pharaoh's chamber in silence, because waking a god is not casual, a ritual. Cleansing begins using sacred water, scented oils, and linen cloths. The pharaoh is bathed by servants. His skin is anointed with oils, frankincense, myrrh, and lotus, symbols of divinity and purity. His hair is combed, sometimes adorned with beads or golden bands. Then comes the dressing. Egyptian kings wore more than just clothes. They wore symbols. The royal kilt, stiff and pleated. The collar, wide and heavy, made of turquoise, carnelian, or gold. A headdress, often the striped Nemes, with a golden cobra at the brow, and sometimes the false beard, a sign of divine authority. Every detail, every color, every texture reminded the people that this was no ordinary man. This was a being chosen by the gods. Bread, dates, figs, lentils, onions, roasted meat, honeyed pastries and jugs of beer or wine. Now, breakfast. The pharaoh's meals were prepared by elite kitchen staff, not simple cooks, but artisans of flavor. Despite the luxury, Egyptian food was modest by modern standards. What mattered wasn't just the food, but how it was served. Servants moved in silence, placing dishes on polished low tables. No forks, no spoons, just hands washed and perfumed. And while the pharaoh ate, scribes read reports. Together they discussed taxes, construction, justice, and even floods. Because ruling Egypt wasn't just ceremony, it was administration. Every day, messages arrived from across the kingdom. Updates from governors, reports from granaries, appeals from temple priests. Decisions had to be made. The pharaoh sat with his vizier, his chief advisor. Scrolls were unrolled, names spoken, orders given. Pools glisten in the morning sun, with lotus flowers drifting gently on the surface. Every decision carried weight. Every signature shaped the lives of thousands. And yet, it wasn't all stress and labor. The palace also had its pleasures. Imagine the pharaoh stepping into his garden, a private oasis behind limestone walls. Palm trees rustle in the breeze. Exotic birds sing in shaded cages. Here, he could walk quietly, reflect, speak with his children, or retreat into a library, rooms filled with papyrus scrolls, sacred hymns, star charts, healing texts, and myths. The world outside was chaos. Inside the palace was calm. Let us now imagine midday. The heat grows heavy. Incense burns in braziers. Servants fan the pharaoh as he listens to petitions from nobles or foreign envoys. Some came bearing gifts, lapis from Mesopotamia, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia. Others came with requests for protection, for alliance, for judgment. The pharaoh's word was law. His silence was power. And always the priests were near. Religion infused every part of palace life. Before major decisions, offerings were made at private temples within the palace. Statues of gods like Ammon, Ra, or Horus stood adorned in gold and linen. The pharaoh himself was seen as Horus in life and Osiris in death. He performed sacred rituals, lighting incense, pouring libations, reciting prayers, not for show, but for balance. For the Mat, the cosmic order that kept Egypt stable. If the king failed to honor the gods, the entire kingdom could suffer. Droughts, plagues, invasion. As evening approached, the palace changed its rhythm. The sun dipped low, lamps were lit, the air cooled. Music drifted through the halls, soft lyres, flutes, and chanting. The pharaoh might host a private banquet. Nobles reclined on cushions. Wine was poured into alabaster cups. Dancers moved slowly. Musicians played beneath carvings of stars and lotus petals. But this was not wild celebration. Even joy had ritual. Even laughter had form. And then came night. The pharaoh returned to his private chamber. Guards were posted at every entrance. Servants folded away robes. The headdress was removed. The oils reapplied. Scrolls and messages were read one final time. And finally, the king was left alone. Perhaps he reflected on the day. Perhaps he thought of battles long past. Perhaps he whispered prayers to Osiris, asking for safe passage through the night. Because even the living God had to face the darkness. Let us pause. Let us imagine the cool stone beneath his feet, the quiet hush of linen curtains, the soft flicker of oil lamps, and the weight, not of gold, but of responsibility. To be pharaoh was to live in beauty and order, but also isolation and ritual, a life of power and endless duty. As we gently leave this chapter, remember this. Behind the towering statues and carved hieroglyphs, there was a man who ruled and listened and dreamed and aged, who woke to bird song, who ate honeyed bread, who stood beneath the same stars we see today. And now, let us move to the next part of our story, the moments when everything went wrong. Famines, plagues, war, when even the gods seemed to turn away. Join me as we step into segment 8, when the Nile betrayed the king. Let the stillness of ancient times settle around you. The Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt. For thousands of years, Its waters brought renewal. Its steady pulse marked the turning of seasons. Its rich silt gave birth to golden wheat fields and lush pastures. It was Egypt's gift, its guardian, its god. But what happened when the Nile turned silent? When the floodwaters failed to rise? When the river that gave everything suddenly gave nothing? Even the Pharaoh, exalted as divine, could do little but watch as the heart of his kingdom began to wither. This is the quiet terror of a failing Nile. Each year, the people waited with hope and dread. Around mid-July, the river was expected to rise, a grand, swelling tide of blue and black, fed by rains from far beyond Egypt's southern border. The flood was a ritual of nature, dependable, sacred. Priests prayed over it. Farmers planned their whole lives around it. Temples watched it. Granaries would fill. Livestock would thrive. There would be festivals, feasts, and peace. When it came just right, it meant abundance. But if the flood was too low, the canals meant to distribute water to distant fields stayed empty. Or too late, or didn't come at all, it meant catastrophe. Imagine now a poor flood year under a weary pharaoh. The signs were subtle at first. The river did not swell as expected. The banks remained dry. The priests were troubled. The farmers were afraid. And the pharaoh, watching from his palace, was forced into action. Because even though he wore gold, he was now at war with nature itself. The failure of the flood brought a chain reaction. Crops withered in the fields, barley, emmer, flax, all dependent on the fertile silt. He scattered incense. He poured wine onto sacred altars. He bowed before towering statues, asking the gods to intervene. Without the water, the land turned to dust. Livestock, once strong and fat, grew thin and sickly. Fish, which filled the people's diets, vanished from the shrinking riverbeds. Markets fell quiet. The chatter of buyers and sellers gave way to silence and empty baskets. The prices of food soared, and hunger crept slowly across the villages. The pharaoh called for ceremonies. He led offerings at the temples of Hapi, god of the Nile, and Osiris, god of fertility and rebirth. He walked in solemn procession, but no rain came. Officials tried to maintain order, but desperation sours the air. The priests chanted deeper. The people grew restless, and the burden of the drought settled squarely on the shoulders of the pharaoh. Because in the eyes of the people, a failing Nile was not just a natural disaster, it was a sign that the king had failed in his divine duties. Now imagine, famine begins. The granaries, built to last through lean years, are opened, but they are not bottomless. Each day, the crowds grow longer. Dysentery, skin infections, fevers that do not break. Mothers press their children forward. Old men plead with empty bowls. And behind palace walls, the king must decide. They do so not just in pain, but in rage. Who receives grain? Who must go without? Which provinces to save? Which temples to tax? Whose cries to ignore? Every choice he makes now brings anger from someone. And with famine comes disease. The weakened bodies of the hungry are easy prey for illness. Even loyal provinces begin to rebel, sensing the king's vulnerability. Plagues of flies. There are no modern hospitals, only herbs, amulets, and chants. And when people die, the divine pharaoh once loved is now blamed. Walls are defaced. His name, once praised in every town, is cursed in the streets. The gods, people whisper, have turned their faces from him. Foreign powers sense the weakness. Neighboring tribes, once held back by Egypt's wealth and armies, begin to probe the borders. Raiding parties attack caravans. Trade routes are cut off. The pharaoh sends troops, but food is short. Horses are thin. Morale is low. What army can fight on empty stomachs? What soldier fights with faith when the temples themselves are silent? The weight of the drought grows heavier each day. In the palace, scrolls pile up. Petitions from villages. Reports from governors, pleas from priests. The king reads them one by one, his brow heavy. Called quiet, families flee to the cities, looking for any work, any meal, any protection. He is surrounded by luxury, gold statues, scented oils, fine linens, yet helpless, because none of those treasures can make the river rise again. And perhaps, in the darkest hours, even the pharaoh himself begins to wonder, have the gods truly abandoned me? We must pause here. And remember, this was not a world of scientific certainty. They didn't know about climate patterns or El Niño or soil erosion. To them, the world was balanced on a delicate scale of cosmic order. And if that balance was broken, the heavens themselves would fall. And who, then, must carry that blame? Not the farmers, not the priests, but the one man chosen to hold the kingdom together, the Pharaoh. Now, imagine a second failed flood year. The Nile rises, but just barely. Crops fail again. Bread is rationed. The temples lose donations. And once again, the king watches it all. Perhaps his health fades. His voice weakens. His faith dims. And still, he must appear strong. Still, he must put on the golden crown, the false beard, the robes of Horus, because weakness in a pharaoh meant collapse for all of Egypt. Finally, the rains return. A third year brings a stronger flood. The fields turn green again. Children laugh. Markets reopen. Life slowly crawls back to normal. But the scars remain. The king is older, more fragile. His name remembered, not for glory, but for the years of hunger and silence. And he knows, for all his power, for all his palaces and titles, he could not control the river. This is the hidden truth of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was revered like a god, but he lived always under the mercy of the Nile. Its rise brought blessings. Its silence brought ruin. And even the greatest kings were just men praying for rain. As we close this segment, let us breathe deeply and let the memory of the river carry us forward to the next chapter in our journey. A time not of silence or prayer, but of threats from beyond the desert, of foreign invaders, and the long, slow fall of a golden empire. Join me in segment 9, Enemies at the Gates,